Not far from the year 500 BC, in the Greek city of Athens, lived Charmides and his wife. To this pair of ancient Greeks was born a son to whom the name of Phidias, or Pheidias, was given. Not another word does history tell us of the father and mother of the greatest sculptor the world has ever known. In the early years of Phidias's life, history is almost equally silent. It is easy to imagine that when he was a tiny lad playing in the street, he drew pictures in the sand, or modeled figures of clay to the delight of his playmates. Perhaps that is the reason why his father decided that he should become an artist, or perhaps it was because Charmides himself was an artist, for it was the custom in ancient Greece for a child to follow the trade of his father. However, it is certain that early in his life young Phidias gave promise of such remarkable skill that he was placed in the charge of the most renowned artists of all Greece. Hygias of Athens, Agelados of Argos, and Polygustus were the teachers who did the most to shape his career. It was Phidias's first ambition to become a painter, but we do not know to what extent that ambition was gratified, for history tells us nothing of his paintings. Perhaps it was because he showed greater promise as a sculptor that his teachers directed him to abandon painting and to confine his efforts to the molding of clay or to the shaping of marble into the human form. But Phidias was not satisfied to work with the marble with which other sculptors delighted. The cold stone, even when colored with the most natural tints, lacked the lifelike expression he would give to his statues. Therefore, he sought other materials that he might reach perfection in his art. We know nothing of his experiments or disappointments. The skill of genius is seldom born. It comes only with years of labor and effort and discouragement, or even with failure. We can imagine the long, hard years of preparation which finally led Phidias to success, for already he was well advanced in life before he charmed the cultured world with statues in a new material, and so lifelike that many who saw them actually believed they were living beings. Though Phidias worked in stone and bronze, he was the first to employ ivory and gold to represent the human face and form. Chryselephantine is the name given to this form of sculpture. No material so closely resembles the tint and the texture of the flesh as ivory. No metal could better represent the clothing and the hair than enameled gold. The core or framework of his statues was of wood, which he overlaid with plates of ivory and gold so skillfully fitted together that the joints were invisible. It seemed that he alone was able to employ the ivory and gold to perfection. Or, perhaps, no states but those of ancient Greece had been appreciative enough of art to make large appropriations for the purchase of such costly materials. It is sad, and strange, too, that among all the sculptures inherited from the ancient world, there is not a single fragment which we can positively say came from the hand of Phidias. There are many statues and reliefs which may have been shaped by him or under his direction, but there is always a doubt if they are his. It is only from the writings of the ancients that we know of his chief works. Of his less important sculptures no records have survived. They tell us of his bronze group at Delphi, with the statues of Apollo and Athena, of the colossal bronze Athena on the Acropolis at Athens, which was visible to the sailors far out to sea, of the Chryselephantine statue of Aphrodite at Elis. One of his statues of Athena was at Pellene, another was at Plataea, but it was in the Parthenon upon the Athenian Acropolis that his chief representation of the goddess stood. It was Chryselephantine, and so wonderfully wrought that it shared with the Olympian Zeus in establishing his fame. At Athens, in the year 444 BC, began the reign of the great Pericles, and the most brilliant period of Greek history and art. Phidias was then fully 50 years of age, and though he had not yet executed the great statues for which he was later renowned, he had acquired a name sufficient to admit him to the circle of distinguished authors and artists and statesmen who frequented the salon of Aspasia, the brilliant wife of Pericles. To adorn Athens with artistic buildings and statues was one of the ambitions of Pericles and Aspasia, and it was Phidias whom they selected to carry out their plans. In full charge of beautifying the city, and with the wealth of the Athenian state at his disposal, Phidias gave to Greece much of the glory for which it has ever been famed. The Parthenon was already nearing completion, but the wonderful sculptures of its frieze were inspired by him and executed by his pupils. He himself, however, devoted his greatest efforts to the statue of Athena, which he made for the Parthenon. 2 small, crude marble copies of it have survived. They represent the standing helmeted goddess with a small victory in the right hand, and with a large circular shield resting on the ground at her left. The core of the statue was of wood, overlaid with thin plates of ivory and gold. A copy of the shield, which was richly engraved with the battle scene, was made in ancient times, and fortunately a fragment of it, found upon the Acropolis, shows the wonderfully fine detail of the work. Many a man upon whom great popular favor had been showered has found that with the favor have come enemies to deprive him of it. So it was with Pericles, who had done so much for Athens, and Phidias, his favorite, was destined to suffer with him. The successes of Phidias had brought him rivals and enemies too, and when the downfall of Pericles was assured, they plotted to rob the great sculptor of his fame. The government had provided for the statue of Athena a large quantity of gold, of which the present value would amount to about $750,000. The enemies of Phidias accused him of stealing a part of the gold and of secreting it for himself, and it seemed that there was no way for him to prove his innocence. The shrewd Pericles, however, had advised Phidias to arrange the gold plates upon the statue so that they might be removed in time of war or threatened invasion, and, to the amazement of his enemies, Phidias removed the plates and had them weighed. None of the gold was missing, and the charge against him was dismissed. But the enemies of Phidias were not discouraged. Among the figures in the battle scene engraved upon the shield by the side of the statue of Athena were 2 which attracted their attention. One was of a man raising a battle axe, concealing half of his face with his arm. It was a likeness of Pericles. The other was the form of an old bald-headed man raising a large stone in the act of hurling it at the enemy. It was a portrait of Phidias. Realism in the religious art of ancient Greece was contrary to custom, and the enemies of Phidias, pretending to be shocked by the appearance of the portraits in so sacred a place, were not slow in accusing him of sacrilege, an act worthy of the greatest punishment. Phidias was arrested and condemned. One tradition says that he was thrown into prison, where he died. Another tradition, perhaps more trustworthy, says that he was banished from Athens. Misfortune is frequently the stepping stone to greater opportunities. And if the tradition be true, the banishment of Phidias resulted in bringing to him honors far greater than any the Athenians had bestowed upon him, and in giving to the world the wonderful statue of the Olympian Zeus. In the western part of the Peloponnesus, in the old kingdom of Elis, is a beautiful, narrow valley through which the river Alpheus flows. It was called by the ancients the fairest spot in Greece. Between the river and the hill sacred to Cronos, the father of Zeus, was the Greek center of worship even in prehistoric times. There later the city of Olympia stood, and there too, about 1000 BC, was built the temple of Hera, the oldest temple in all of Greece. Its ruins still lie at the base of the sacred hill. Nearby was the stadium where the Olympic Games had been held long before the year 776 BC, the date given as the first Olympiad, and there they continued for more than 1,000 years. In that same valley, the independence of the Greeks continued long after the rest of Greece was ruled by strangers. Olympia was the most sacred, the most popular city in all Greece. perhaps of all the world. About the year 470 BC, the great temple of Zeus was built in the very center of Olympia. It stood upon a substructure 3 steps high. 36 tall granite columns surrounded it. The 3 parts of its interior were separated by similar columns. One of its friezes, sculpted by the best Greek artists and representing the chariot race of Enomaus and Pelops, contained 21 colossal figures. The temple was so closely associated with the Olympic Games that it was held in the greatest reverence by the Greeks of all the world. Only to the eastern of the 3 sections of the interior was the public admitted. In the central section, the visitors in the games were crowned with olive wreaths. The western was the Holy of Holies, reserved for the statue of Zeus, where the priests alone might enter. The people were permitted to gaze upon the face of the deity only from a distance, as the curtain before it was drawn aside. It was just as the great temple of Zeus was nearing completion that Phidias fled from Athens, and accompanied by his cousin, or his brother, Paninos, the painter, and by some of his pupils, he appeared at Olympia. Though a refugee, he was given a hearty welcome. The Holy of Holies in the temple was still waiting for a statue of the deity to adorn it. For though sculptors had been found to decorate the temple itself, none had yet been chosen to make an image worthy of the great Zeus. All the world knew of the skill and fame of Phidias, and at once he was commissioned by the Eleans to make the statue. Phidias accepted the commission. Perhaps it was because his cruel persecution by the Athenians was fresh in his mind that he determined that the Olympian statue should surpass in every respect the Athena of the Parthenon. Near the holy grove he built a workshop, and in its center he erected an altar to the 12 great gods whom he invoked each morning before he began the work of the day. Gold, silver, ivory, precious stones, and bronze were supplied him in abundance. Carefully he constructed the wooden framework of the statue, strengthened it with iron stays, and saturated it with oil to prevent it from decay. With thin sheets of ivory made pliable by fire and carefully joined together, he overlaid the wood to represent the flesh. The eyes were the choicest of gems. The mantle of gold draped over the left shoulder and arm, and all studded with enameled flowers and small figures, fell in graceful folds about the legs. On the head was a laurel wreath of gold, enameled green, and the feet were shod with golden sandals. Every part of the huge throne upon which the statue was seated was decorated with the greatest care. Its arms were supported with sphinxes, each holding a youth in its arms. The background of its front was painted blue. Even the back was adorned with the 3 graces, and on the other sides were mystic scenes representing the struggles of Hercules, the combats of Theseus with the Amazons, and the family of the Niobe. The footstool rested on lions, and it too was engraved with the combats of Theseus. On each side of the feet were 4 small figures, of which one was a Diodemunos winding a fillet about his head. At last, after 2 Olympiads, or 8 long years of labor, the statue was completed to the satisfaction of the great artist. The platform upon which it stood in the Holy of Holies measured nearly 20 feet in width and 30 in length, and it too was covered with metal plates richly engraved with mythological scenes. Among them were Aphrodite emerging from the sea, the chariot of Helios rising in the morning, and the car of Selene descending into the deep at night. The roof before the statue was open to the sky to admit the light, according to the custom in the temples of ancient Greece, but above the statue was a covering to protect it from the rains. We do not know just how high the statue was, But the ancient authors say that its head reached the roof 40 feet above the foundation. Before it was suspended a beautifully painted curtain to secrete it from the eyes of those who entered the first 2 chambers of the temple. The great work of Phidias was completed, and an inscription was engraved upon it that future generations might know its sculptor. It remained only for the great Zeus to give some sign of approval of the statue made to represent him. A tradition says that in a prayer, Phidias asked if his work was acceptable, and immediately in reply, a bolt of lightning flashed down through the open roof to the pavement before the statue. Thus, Zeus spoke to express his pleasure, and for centuries, a beautiful bronze vase stood to mark the place where the lightning had struck. Nor were the people of Olympia, or the throngs of visitors who came to witness the games, less pleased. The fame of Phidias spread. Worshippers came from far and near to see the wonderful statue, and the authors of those days never tired of describing it. One tells us that, quote, Phidias alone had seen the likeness of the gods, or he alone has made them visible, end quote. Another said, quote, no one who has seen Phidias' Zeus can imagine any other semblance of a god, end quote. A third added, quote, those who enter the temple no longer think they see ivory from the Indus or beaten gold from Thrace, but the son of Kronos and Rhea, transferred to earth by Phidias. End quote. Perhaps Dio Chrysostom, of about 100 AD, paid the highest tribute to the great sculptor. He said, were any so heavily burdened with cares and afflicted with sorrows that even sweet sleep would not refresh him, standing before the statue he would, I firmly believe, forget all that was fearful and crushing in life. So wonderfully hast thou, O Phidias, conceived and completed thy work. Such heavenly light and grace is in thy art. For centuries after the statue was completed, it was considered a calamity to die without having seen it. For so lifelike did it seem that the common people thought it to be a real, living god. Even in the time of Hadrian, a picture of it was stamped on the coins. Of the life of Phidias, after he completed the statue, history tells us nothing. One tradition, but apparently it is without foundation, says that his troubles at Athens were repeated at Olympia, that he was accused of stealing the gold which the government had furnished him, and was condemned to prison, where he died. Some believe that he completed the Olympian statue even before he made the Athena of the Parthenon, and that his life was ended in an Athenian prison. However, it seems that in Olympia his name was always honored, for his descendants, of whom we know next to nothing, were employed by the state to care for the statue. Fortunately, we can follow the history of the statue for nearly 1,000 years, until the time when Zeus had become a myth of the ancients. 60 years after it was completed, cracks appeared in its ivory plates, and Demophon of Mycenae was employed to repair them. Somewhat later, in some mysterious manner, 2 of its great gold locks were stolen. In Caesar's time, it was struck by lightning, but no serious damage seems to have resulted. The Emperor Caligula conceived the idea of transporting it to Rome and of perpetuating his glory by substituting his own face for that of the god. The story says that when the workmen laid their hands upon the statue to remove it, a great peal of laughter burst from the lips of Zeus, and they fled in terror. That the ship that was waiting in the nearest harbor to carry it away was struck by lightning and was burned. In 393 AD, the Olympic Games ceased, and the city rapidly declined. In 408, during the reign of Theodosius II, the temple was burned. Possibly the statue was burned with it, or, if it survived, it was broken up and carried away. Another story says that in the year 390, Theodosius I took it to Constantinople, where it perished in the fire of the year 416. The same story, however, is related of the Athena of the Parthenon, and in later ages the two statues were frequently confused. Though the temple had been burned by the plundering Goths, its walls continued to stand, and they were converted into a Christian fortress. But a century later an earthquake cast them down. Gradually the waters of the river Alpheus overflowed the ruins, burying them in silt from the neighboring hills. In time the city was forgotten, and so it remained during the long centuries of the Dark Middle Ages, even to our own day. In the year 1875, the Germans began the excavations of Olympia and continued their work until the March of 1881. The entire site of the old city was buried to a depth of 16 feet. Down beneath the silt, near the base of the sacred Kronion, was the stadium where the famous games were held. Nearby was the foundation of the old temple of Hera. Among the ruins of the houses was the home of Nero when he was a contestant in the games. In a great confusing mass, the very center of the ruined city, lay the fallen columns and the sculptures of the famous temple. It was a laborious task to uncover them, but one after another those ancient treasures were rescued. The temple foundation was uncovered. The Holy of Holies, where the statue stood, was cleared, and though its platform had been taken away, one might clearly see where it had been. In the pavement is a little hole, perhaps the very hole which the temple priests used to point out whenever they told the story of how Zeus spoke to Phidias through the lightning flash. When now you visit the site of this famous old Greek city, you see only a mass of foundation walls nearly hidden among the overgrowing bushes. In the stadium, you find the marble slabs which marked the starting point of the Olympic runners. You trace the narrow streets among the homes. You stand amazed, looking at the huge fallen columns of the great temple. You enter the Holy of Holies, where in the early days none but the feet of a priest trod. Upon the little hill overlooking the ruins, close by the hotel, you find a low white building. It is a museum, where nearly all that remain of the sculptured treasures are stored. There you see Pelops with Hippodamia at his side. There are the labors of Hercules, the wonderful Hermes by Praxiteles, and the battle of the centaurs. But there remains not one small fragment of Phidias's great masterpiece, the statue of Zeus, the wonder of all the ancient world.